First off, I just want to say thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm very excited to talk about recycling with all of you. And this is a passion of mine, not only in the general just consumer space, but also in the commercial space. I've been in this industry for a very long time. And again, I'm very excited to be with you today. So I think he's sharing my presentation. So one thing I would say is that if you have any questions for me along the way, feel free to jump in the chat, drop me a question. I certainly don't need to wait till the very end to get all of your questions. And, I'd rather have kind of a back and forth conversation as we get going here. But again, thank you so much. So a little bit about me. So I am the Chief Revenue Officer for Impact Recycling. We are located in Philadelphia. I've been here for about a year. I've spent the last 28 years of my career, though, in the recycling space. And I've largely spent most of my time in the hazardous waste industry. And I would say that the grand majority of my career and my passion lies on the hazardous waste side, but I do have a lot of ideas and a lot of interaction in the just the commercial space and the residential space when it comes to recycling. So I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about the impacts of recycling and just how we can better ourselves as we move through some of the challenges that we have today. So a little bit about Impact Recycling, just so that you have a bit of background about what I do. So again, I've been here for about a year, and in that year, I have learned more about the corrugated recycling industry than I think I've ever realized was out there. So we started in 1956, and we started largely by essentially like a Cintas type business. And if you think about that, you think about the fact that we're a Cintas type business is in a lot of manufacturing spaces, a lot of retail spaces, that type of thing. So the owner back in 1956 was doing work for a company called Tasty Cake. And if you're not familiar with Tasty Cake, they're very similar to a Hostess or a Little Debbie or something like that, but they're located here in Philadelphia. And basically what he was doing at the time was, again, he was servicing them from a Cintas type cleaning industry. And they had a large audit coming up. And what they asked our owner to do at the time was to take about 40,000 boxes that they had away so that they wouldn't get any kind of repercussions on their audit for having these boxes. So he took the boxes away, and he actually took them and he resold them into the sustainability space for a retailer. And from there, Impact Recycling was born. So basically what we do is we take corrugate, creates bottles or caps, or buys bottles and caps, anything that is of consistent size. We take those boxes, we purchase them, and then we resell them in the secondary retail space. So like a Marshalls or Burlington, that type of thing. And they use them as a transaction for, or transportation from their DC out to their retail space. So amazing industry. Never even knew it existed. And from there, we basically started to delve into the recycling for all of the customers that we were dealing with. So we started recycling the plastics and the banding, the pallets, and everything you can possibly imagine from soup to nuts on that. So that's how I got started with this industry, or with this company about a year ago. Really innovative company and exciting company to be a part of. So again, I spent the grand majority of my career in the hazardous waste space. So I have a lot of industry experience with working with companies that are trying to get their materials out of landfill, out of the incineration market, and into something else. So again, exciting industry to be in. I never thought I'd end up there. I'm a farmer's daughter, and really never thought about this space very much until I got into it, but I absolutely love it. So tonight, what I thought we'd do is we talk a little bit about the definition and the concept of recycling, some of the benefits of recycling, and we'll go through the economic and the social benefits of recycling. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's the difference between recycling and waste disposal. And we hear a lot about that when you sign up with your trash company on a daily basis, right? And you don't really know where your materials go at the end of the day. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about the types of materials that are out there that can get recycled and some of the challenges behind them. And this is really where I think a lot of our interaction between all of us tonight will occur, because we see these materials on a daily basis. And I think all of us can think back to a moment where we think, is this recyclable? Is it not recyclable? Can I put it in that bin? What bins should I put it in? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about the role of technology in recycling. And then we're going to also go through the recycling process from collection all the way through where the consumer participates. And then we'll talk a little bit about the myths and the facts behind recycling. And then we're also going to talk about recycling at home versus recycling in the workplace, and then some challenges and some impacts on climate change when it comes to recycling. So if you want to go ahead and fast forward to the next slide. Does the next slide come up?
Let me know which slide.
The next one down.
That one?
They don't seem to be moving. Are they
Oh, there
moving
may
up?
be some delay.
Maybe there's a delay. Oh, you gotta love technology, folks.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
There's
All
a
right.
long delay.
Bill, make sure you're sharing the right screen.
What screen am I sharing? It looks like I'm sharing the presentation.
Yeah,
Well,
I
I
think
saw you click on open it with PowerPoint, but I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking at the previous thing you were viewing it with, maybe your mail.
right.
Can you see that now, Mary Lynn? Can you see that?
I can, but I just see the IRP slide. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Okay.
It needs to be downloaded and to open it, to
Okay.
share the screen. It looks like we're in an email.
Yeah. So while he's doing that, let's keep talking. Like I said, I know we have a Phillies game and we got lots of other things to talk about tonight. So, so obviously waste management, it has long been a critical concern in modern society. And I think all of us strive for more sustainable packaging, more sustainable practices, and we yearn for that pivotal solution, right? And I think all of us wouldn't be on this call today if we weren't intimately involved in some kind of interaction and wanting a better type of solution to recycling. And that's what we're really going to talk about tonight. We're going to delve into the concept of recycling household waste and what happens to it at the end of its life. And we're also going to talk about the significance of diverting waste away from landfills and some of the environmental and economic benefits that come about with that. So let's talk about the definition of recycling. So recycling is a process that obviously involves collecting, sorting, and processing used materials, also known as recyclables or waste, into new products or materials. So I want to take a minute before we go any further on that and talk about the definition of recyclables versus waste. So I've spent a lot of my career in the hazardous waste and solid waste space. And for me, the definition of waste is something totally different than recyclables. And I hesitate sometimes to use that word waste because I would much rather call it a recyclable versus a waste. and I know there's some, conflict out there about what those definitions are. But me personally, I would rather call everything that goes into that yellow or green bin that you have, I would rather call that a recyclable versus a waste. I think as soon as we call it a waste, we put it in the trash, something happens with it, and we don't know what happens to it from there. And so for me, I'd rather call all of these things recyclable. So if you hear me talk about it as we go through this process, anything that can truly be recycled is a recyclable for me. So and there also is a lot of conflict out there that talks about, is it a recyclable if it can be incinerated? Is it a recyclable if it has some other use or some other home? So there are some definitions out there that are conflicting, but we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight as well. So again, there are some key reasons why recycling is important to environmental conservation. And one of the biggest ones that I think all of us hears about is that resource conservation, right? So we hear about how recycling is out there to conserve our valuable resources and what we have. You can go to the next slide. And we talk about recycling as a way to conserve our natural resources. So we're talking about metals and minerals and timber and how we can reduce and reuse things so that we're not using virgin resources versus being able to reuse something over and over and over again. The other, next slide. The other thing we talk about is energy savings, right? So the recycling process can consume far less energy than actually extracting some of the raw materials from the earth. So we talk about, down later in my slides, we'll talk a little bit about aluminum, but recycling aluminum actually uses far less energy than recycling bauxite ore, which is used to make aluminum. And there's a lot of energy savings that goes into that with less contribution to greenhouse gases, and obviously being able to reuse things over and over again is just beneficial to the entire process of being able to reuse a material like aluminum over and over and over again. Next slide. We also talk about the economic benefits that come with recycling, lots of job opportunities, and we see that more and more with more of the MRFs that are created nowadays, and more opportunity on the sale of recycled materials versus just mining for raw materials. Next slide. One of the other things that I think a lot of folks don't often realize is how long a product can extend its life when it comes to recycling. So there are a lot of things that I've worked on over my career that can lead into new products and extend the life of something that you may not have always thought about when it comes to recycling. So I'll share a little bit about a project that I worked on, I guess about 10 years ago. I worked on a project to recycle shingles. And if you think about shingles, everyone has them, right? So, well, most people have asphalt shingles on their roof. And it is the #1 largest non-hazardous waste stream that goes into a landfill. Obviously, we all get a new roof, say every 20 years or so, and those roofs create an incredible amount of waste in our landfills. I was lucky enough to work on a project to actually strip the sand off of those shingles and reuse the asphalt shingle itself back into roadbed. So if you've ever seen sort of a small cutout of what goes into roadbed, it's pretty interesting in the fact that there are actually anywhere between like 8 and 20 layers that go into roadbed, depending on what kind of roadbed you actually need. So those asphalt shingles actually get ground up, put back into roadbed, and essentially go back into the asphalt where they were intended for originally. And then the sand that is on a shingle actually gets made into a type of spray. It gets melted down, but put into a liquid type material, and it actually goes to Asian countries to combat saltwater erosion on bridges. Again, really great project that I got the chance to work on. But again, it just proves that there really is an extended product life to some of these materials out there that you might not always consider as a recyclable that is, in your daily life. Next slide. The other thing, obviously, that goes along with recycling is public awareness and responsibility. And it's more important now than it's ever been for all of us to be, advocates for recycling and being able to get out there and educate individuals and even our friends and our family about how important it is to reduce and reuse and recycle materials that can truly be recycled. And sometimes it's hard to have that conversation, right? It's hard to have that conversation with friends and family, because if you're not as super passionate about it like I am, it's coming from a place that might be a little awkward, right? So for me, I think most of my friends and family, when I talk to them about recycling or I talk to them about what are they doing with certain things, they know that it's coming from a voice that is truly passionate about things. And I think all of us have that awareness and responsibility to do the same. Next slide. So another thing that comes along with recycling is obviously waste reduction into landfills and incinerators. And I want to take a minute and talk about incineration, because I came from a background in where most of my early upbringing in the EHS realm actually focused on incineration. So it's one of those things that's a catch-22, where people hear that zero waste and zero landfill, and they wonder what the difference is between zero waste and zero landfill. And if you hear somebody talk about zero waste, it's largely meaning that they are diverting greater than 90% of their waste from a landfill that does not include incineration. If you hear somebody talk about zero landfill, generally they're talking about something that also includes incineration. Now, it's tricky when it comes to residential waste, because you really only have two choices outside of true recycling or single stream recycling, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But you have landfill and you have incineration. Now, there are benefits to both. And again, there are a lot of naysayers that say landfill or incineration isn't the way to go. It's, it contributes to greenhouse gases and things like that. But oftentimes, if you look at a waste to energy plant that's taking in that trash, it's generally creating energy for a community. And even though the ash from that incineration ends up in a landfill, oftentimes there's a greater good for that type of incineration versus just going to landfill and nothing else. So again, it's a little bit of a catch-22. I know that some folks have stronger feelings one way or another, but for me personally, I truly think that if you only have one of those choices, where you only have a landfill or an incinerator, incineration is a little bit better of a way to go, just simply because it's diverting waste from a landfill. Anybody have any questions on that one? I know that one is sort of a, type of conversation piece. I see a couple people say, I guess something about detergent bottles more recyclable than a bag. We're going to actually get into plastic bags here in a little bit, but again, I think when it comes to just our daily lives, I think it's just important that we understand where our waste is going. It's really important that we just take a step back and we actually ask our trash companies, does our material actually go for incineration or does it go for landfill? I think that's kind of step number one. And we're gonna talk about that a little bit more at the very end. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about lower greenhouse gases. This again, goes into a conversation piece about whether or not material that is actually being recycled reduces greenhouse emissions, and where can we conserve energy, and what kind of processes materials go through. So again, recycling can lower greenhouse gas emissions as long as it's being recycled properly. Oftentimes I see materials that don't go into the correct recycling industry, or actually end up sort of like greenwashing, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But it goes into a facility that might not always be the correct place for a material to go, where it actually could go for recycling to a different process that say uses less energy or creates a different product. So again, lowering greenhouse gas emissions through recycling is a little bit of a touchy subject, because it just really depends on what the final disposition for that material is. I saw somebody pop in the chat here. So it looks like Kay said, or let me back up. So Anne said, how can you make sure your shingles get recycled? So one of the things you can ask is, you can ask the company that actually takes the roof off of your house and ask them what they're doing with it. Unfortunately, a lot of companies send it directly to a C&D landfill, which is construction and demolition. It's the easiest, and it is the cheapest way to get rid of shingles. But you do have the option to ask someone who's taking your roof off if they can actually recycle your shingles. And there are plenty of options out there. It's just a matter of how much you want to pay. Again, it's a catch-22, right? We want to recycle, but sometimes it just costs a little bit more. Kay said, I consider incineration problematic because of the energy used to burn, as well as the pollutants in the air. So, Kay, I'm right there with you. I totally understand what you're saying. One of the things, though, to consider is that materials that go into a landfill also create an exorbitant amount of methane. And oftentimes, some of the landfills are capturing that while others are not. Again, it boils down to asking that question, right? Where is my material going, and how is it being treated? So, if a landfill is capturing their methane, great. If not, then that's actually just as problematic as it is going into incineration. And it looks like Maria has a question or a comment that went along with it, said, if a landfill does methane capture, do they have a lower or greater carbon footprint than a waste energy plant? So I don't know the answer to that fully, Maria, but what I would say is that, both have pros and cons, right? And again, you're giving back to a grid when it comes to incineration. So it's not always it's not always apples to apples, but it's an excellent question, and I'll do some research on it. I don't have a perfect answer on that, but I definitely can ask. It looks like Zeta asks, recent New York Times article talked about collecting recyclables that wind up straight to incinerator. We're going to actually talk about that. So everything you're talking about, like margarine tubs, some of the PET material, that kind of thing, we're actually going to talk about that in a little bit, and where things actually end up. So next slide. You can actually skip that slide. We'll go to the next one. Okay. So one of the other things I want to just talk about real quick is pollution reduction. And again, this kind of goes along with some of the recycling and incineration conversations that we've already been having. But generally speaking, recycling can reduce the need for reduces some of the pollutants that are in the air, just because of the way that they're recycled. And we're going to talk about the processes that go into recycling some materials, and some of them are better than others. And we're going to talk a little bit about which ones are better than others in a couple slides. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about land conservation. Obviously, when you recycle, we're not using as much space in a landfill, and we're obviously just decreasing the amount of land needed for that kind of disposal. But again, there are some challenges when it comes to recycling and using space that could normally go for something else. So, and again, it goes along with following the path of your recyclables and finding out where they actually end up. And it's not always a clear path when it comes to that. Oftentimes we think about recyclables ending up in a brand new product, but sometimes, like plastic bags that someone mentioned before, they don't always end up where they should be. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit too. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about some common materials that get recycled. So the four I listed there, paper and cardboard, plastics, glass, and metal, are pretty much the most common types that you can run into. And I think all of us have those in our home. We all use them on a daily basis, and we wonder maybe if they go into that single stream recycling, where do they go? You can go to the next slide. So this is just a visual of the most common recyclables that are out there. So we talk about newspaper, magazines, mixed paper, cardboard, all different kinds of paper, aluminum cans, glass, that type of thing. Now, obviously, again, there are some things that are more difficult to recycle than others. And I wanted to highlight a couple of things when it comes to household hazardous waste that we put in our single stream that we don't realize that we might not realize that are super difficult to recycle. So the first thing I want to talk about is something called a mixed recyclable. And you can go to the next slide if you'd like. So mixed recyclables are products that are essentially made up of more than one material. So if any of you have children, I always use this type example because I think it's one of those things I always look at that you think should be recyclable and it's really not. But my children love applesauce that comes in these little pouches, and the little pouches have a little nub on the top. But if you were to pull that entire applesauce pouch apart, it actually has about 4 or 5 different materials in it that make it really difficult to recycle. So it has a plastic nub on the top, an aluminum liner, it has plastic on the outside, a wax coating. All of those things are food grade, but when you get it into a recycling program, it's actually really difficult to break apart. Just because when you think about traditional recycling likes just say the PET that's in the cap or the polypropylene that's in the wrapping. So it's hard when you try to recycle those materials that have a lot of different layers. And there aren't any really great ways to pull material apart like that. I've done a couple of studies with a couple of different recycling facilities about these mixed recyclables. And there's really just not a great piece of machinery out there yet that can pull those things apart. One of the other things that I think too that I wanted to talk about were paper cups. So you walk into your favorite Starbucks and you think, great, this is, I've got this Starbucks cup and it feels like it's recyclable and it's so perfect. And then you walk over to the recycling bin and all of a sudden there's half of a recycling bin that says landfill, half that says recyclables, and you're sitting there and you have a paper cup in your hand with a plastic lid. So now what do you do, right? So where does that cup actually end up? And unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, that cup actually ends up in the landfill because folks don't really know what to do with it. Now, if they just took the 2 pieces apart, most likely it would go for proper recycling if that particular Starbucks had a single stream recycling container that actually took the recycling away. And I thought it was interesting that one day I was actually in a coffee shop that had one of those trash bins that had a divider in the middle, and it said landfill on one side, recycling on the other. And I looked in the container and it was all one container. So it wasn't even being separated, which I thought was really interesting. And that goes back to that whole sort of greenwashing scenario that people go through, where they think they're doing the right thing and they throw it in the recycling container and it ends up in the trash anyway. So there are a lot of issues when companies use mixed materials for, say, like their paper cups or whatnot, to be able to recycle them correctly. Another story I wanted to share real quick is I had the chance to go to France back in April, and the Starbucks there actually use 100% recycled cardboard in their cups and their lids. So they don't actually have a mixed material in their when they use their cups. So it's 100% recycled cardboard. It doesn't have a wax coating. The way that it's manufactured is a very, very tight weave of that cardboard, so it can withstand the temperature and the liquid for a longer period of time. And then that whole entire cup can actually be recycled. I think it also goes to show that the European model is a little bit further ahead than we are in some things. The European model generally has been ahead of where the US model is with recycling for quite a long time. But we're getting there slowly but surely. But again, I was surprised to see that coffee cup and how different it was just between France and here. One of the other things too that I think that a lot of people have in their homes that are difficult to understand whether or not it can be recycled are things that are in a carton. So if you think about milk or juice, it seems like it's cardboard, right? And it seems like it should be an easy thing to be recycled. But if you think about actually like a milk carton is made up of again, 4 or 5 different materials. It's made up of cardboard. It's made up of wax. It's made up of plastic because it generally has a plastic cap and it has a plastic interlocking liner. So when it gets to a single stream recycling facility, generally those materials will go for incineration. They're actually a very good product to be incinerated, but most of the time they can't be separated well enough and fast enough to actually go for recycling. Another material that's a little bit tricky that you might find in your recycling or questioning whether or not you can recycle it is toothpaste. Again, one of those things most of us have in our home. But if you actually look at a toothpaste container, it actually has a liner on the inside, which is usually aluminum. It has an exterior packaging, which is usually a plastic or a PET type material, and then it has a plastic cap. So all of those things create a myriad of issues when you're trying to recycle certain things. And it'll get to a single sort recycling facility and generally gets kicked out. Again, it's not a super easy thing to recycle. I just recently actually worked on a project as well to try to work to recycle things that have fiberglass in them. So again, just on a personal note, I have kids that play hockey. They have fiberglass hockey sticks, super difficult to recycle. You can't really separate resin from that fiberglass. So a lot of things that are made from fiberglass are inherently difficult to separate. I also just worked on a project with a company that recycles windmill turbines and windmill blades. The windmill blades are made up of fiberglass, really difficult material to separate, and they generally try to grind them and separate them, but again, very, very difficult to separate. So while it may seem like it's a simple material on the surface, it's not always the easiest to separate in the long run. One of the other things I wanted to address was materials that have contamination. So I know that we all think, when we think about recycling, the first thing that comes to mind is our recycling, township recycling, or whatever it is, won't take my pizza container, right? Because it's contaminated. Well, most pizza boxes used to be waxed boxes, and they're not generally waxed anymore. And it's largely because of that recycling part. Although a waxed box can be recycled, it's just a little more difficult. If you put a waxed box in with your cardboard on the street, generally it'll get kicked out pretty quickly at a sort facility, just because that wax, if you think about when a candle melts, obviously it gets very liquidy, and when it dries or when it hardens, it gets very sticky. So the same thing happens when you recycle corrugate and you have a corrugate material that has a wax coating on it. That material actually starts to melt as they recycle it, and it gets sticky and it sort of clings to everything else. So that's part of the reason why when you look at your pizza box and you're like, hey, why can't I stick this in my recycling? That's the first issue. The second issue comes along with contamination. And anything that is generally, that generally has some type of food contamination, it's a problem for a recycler. And the reason why it's a problem for the recycler is because it can start to grow mold. It can start to grow some type of bacteria on it. And that's really tough to get off of, particularly corrugate. Corrugate doesn't usually go through a washing process like a lot of other materials. So it is a little more difficult to manage. So if you get pizza and you notice that it actually has a piece of wax paper in it, kudos to the pizza manufacturer or pizza place that you're ordering it from, because that box actually should be able to be recycled, because generally that means that the box is not waxed, and as long as there's not a lot of pizza on it, you should be able to recycle it. So again, it's one of those crazy things that you don't really think about too much until you see that piece of wax paper in there, but actually kudos to the pizza location that's doing that. So I saw a note in the chat about Colgate, and I wanted to just bring that up. So Colgate Total now has a recyclable tube. Tube shows the green triangle, has been around for the last few months. Yep. Totally. I actually had the chance to work with Colgate with some of their recyclable tubes. The materials that Colgate creates, we actually, my facility here in Philadelphia actually takes some of that material in for recycling. So you're 100% right. We're going to talk a little bit about that little triangle too. The little triangle sometimes is misleading. It can say that, I think, mentally we see that little triangle, we're like, oh, it's 100% recyclable, or we can put it in with our single stream. It's not always the case, but you are right about the Colgate Total. Colgate's been working on a new toothpaste tube for quite a while. So let me back up. John asked, is there a current dependable percentage of what we all are already separating for recycling? I don't have a good answer for that. I would say, it just depends on where you are, where you live, and whether you have options to be able to recycle things. I know, unfortunately, I was just working, which if anybody's from Dallas on this call, unfortunately, Dallas, the city, actually doesn't have any recycling. They don't do it. What's that? Did I hear somebody jump on? So I'm working with a hotel down in Dallas, and they actually will not provide recycling for them. So it's one of those things. I think it just depends on where you live for that kind of a percentage. So while we're on that little triangle, let's talk a little bit about plastics and why plastics sometimes can be some of the most difficult materials to recycle. So right now, there are 7 different kinds of plastics that have that little triangle on them. So generally you'll see the little triangle and a little number on the inside, and that little number corresponds with the type of product that it is. You can stay on that slide if you want. So when we think of plastics, I think most of us think, oh, well, they've got to be recyclable, right? It's plastic, right? But the truth is that really, unless you see a 1 or a 2 on that plastic bottle or container, most of the other numbers that you see when it comes to plastic, they're difficult to recycle for a myriad of reasons. So if you think about a number 1, so number 1 in that little triangle has PET, or polyethylene terephthalate. And usually that is a very rigid, clear kind of material. So usually like you'll see them in like a Gatorade bottle, or like a couple of the squeeze bottles I saw the other day. Those are made of PET. Anything that has that number 1 on it is a very recyclable material. It can go for multiple uses, and it can be reused many times. Same thing with a number 2 recyclable. So that's a high density polyethylene. And they're usually the ones you see like with a milk bottle or juice bottle. They're a little less rigid. So even when you feel them and touch them, you can kind of identify the fact that they aren't super rigid like a number 1, but they still are highly recyclable. Now, when you get below a 1 or a 2, you start to get into some issues. So when you get below a 1 or a 2, sometimes you get into things called polyvinyl chloride and or PVC. So if you think about PVC piping, right? PVC piping in your plumbing and that type of thing. A lot of materials are made of PVC. Carpets made of PVC, pipes are made of PVC, often floor tiles are made of PVC. It can be recycled, but it is challenging. A lot of times with PVC, it requires a very high temperature to either melt it or put it into a different form, which requires a lot of energy. And it can off-gas, which is an issue. So it is a little bit more challenging. And then as you move through the numbers, things get less and less recyclable as you move down. So if you think about a plastic bag, and I know I see a lot of folks that always ask this question about, hey, I drop off my plastic bags at a grocery market. What happens to them from there? So those plastic bags are almost to the end of their life when it comes to recycling plastic. Generally, China has taken those plastic bags and they have been the major recycler for them for many, many years. And now they're starting to say they don't want them anymore. There's actually a really fascinating video out there, and you can probably Google it and find it, but they put some air tags on some of those plastic bags that were being thrown into the cardboard containers at, say, a grocery market, and they actually air tagged them to see where they ended up. I think it was something like 90% of them ended up in a landfill, unfortunately. And really it's because those plastic bags get mixed in with something else. They're very difficult to separate out from a single stream recycling. And they end up going into landfill because they're really not worth much by the time they get to a recycling facility. So that's not to say you shouldn't still recycle your bags, but again, it comes down to consumer education and asking the question, where do my bags end up, right? Do they end up in the right hands? Do they end up at another recycling facility, or do they end up in a landfill? And I could bet that most grocery chains have no idea where those plastic bags go. So it's up to you to really look at the container to see where the plastic bags are being placed into and follow up with that company, whoever's picking them up. The last thing I wanted to talk about was glass. And I think this is one of those other things that people don't realize can be a very difficult material to recycle. And the reason being is that glass comes in a multitude of different colors. And there are some glass containers that are way more recyclable than others. But overall, glass is a highly recyclable material as long as it's not treated or has some type of label on it that makes it not recyclable. There are a lot of different types of beverages out there now that come in a glass container that actually has a UV lining on them. And particularly when it comes to alcoholic beverages. So if you think about alcoholic beverages, like just beer and wine, a lot of times that glass now has a UV filter on it, which makes it pretty difficult to recycle because you can't destroy that unless you have a very, very high temperature to actually destroy that UV lining. And you wouldn't know that to see it because it's not particularly evident, but it can be difficult. And again, that's the reason why a lot of communities are now going to a place where you can't put glass in your single stream recycling. It's simply because it's difficult to get out. And also, if it breaks in a single stream recycling container, it's difficult. And now everything is contaminated with glass and also that UV lining. I work with a lot of recyclers on the beverage side. And one of the things that I actually just did a project with Bud Light, with Budweiser, to recycle about 150 truckloads of their materials. And we had a difficult time with some of their materials on both the glass side and the aluminum side because of the labels that were on the container. Sometimes it's really difficult to get that label off, and some manufacturers are moving to a zip type liner, where some other manufacturers are moving to actually etching onto their glass, or actually printing 3D right onto their cans, which makes them far more recyclable versus someone who actually has an adhesive labeling on it. So, so any questions about that before I go any further? I know I'm kind of talking kind of quickly here. All right, so let me see. All right, so let's talk. You can go to the next slide. That's going backwards. You can go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about technology and recycling. So what I did was I listed a couple of companies here. Going into 2024, right now, there are about 2,000 companies that are working on different technology trends within the recycling space. I think one of the coolest things that I've seen so far really pertains to identifying materials in real time when you actually put a material into a recycling bin. It goes along with AI technology. And I think we've all seen this grow, especially over in the last year. But I won't go through all these companies just for the essence of time. But if you want to really look at some really cool companies that are doing some crazy things in the recycling space, all of these on the screen are doing some amazing things. They're coming up with all different kinds of technologies that say, if you see a trash can on the street, it can automatically sort it for you, just basically based on either the number that's on the bottom of the plastic or reading the actual type of material as it's being thrown into the container. Next slide. All right, so before I get into the recycling process, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some myths and that go on in the recycling industry. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just whether or not there's and again, this goes around that the triangle we talked about earlier, the recycling arrows, which is also called a Mobius, on a container always means that that material is recyclable. And the answer is that really only in some cases can that material be recycled? So again, it goes back to what I was talking about, materials that have that sort of triple or quadruple layer. It might have that Mobius on it, but all that means is that the FTC requires that that product have a 60% content in that material that can be recycled. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's recyclable. It just says that 60% of that material it has materials in it that could be recycled. So again, going back to like my applesauce example. So yes, it is recyclable, and everything that's in that applesauce pouch is recyclable, but can you break it apart to effectively recycle it? Probably not. So again, a little bit of a misnomer there. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the myth around containers and whether they have to be squeaky clean before they go into the recycling process. And the answer there is actually false. It doesn't necessarily have to be squeaky clean. It has to be a little bit clean, but it doesn't have to be pristinely dry and free of any kind of food or whatnot on the inside. Most recyclables that are going through a MRF type facility, they're getting washed anyway. They like to be as clean as possible because it reduces the need for water. The last thing I wanted to talk about as far as myths go is whether or not everything in a single stream can go for recycling. So if you think about your container that goes to the curb, doesn't really matter what you put in there. You know, your hauler's going to take it all away anyway and sort it. And the answer there is really false. And that's because, especially in smaller towns that don't have great recycling facilities, it's really difficult to actually pick apart some of these materials that end up in a single stream recycling container, and they actually end up getting picked apart by hand. And most of the materials that have to be picked out by hand, they actually end up at the landfill anyway, or waste energy. So again, it's good to focus on materials that are clean bottles, cans, paper, cardboard, all those things. And if you think about it, if you're not sure whether something is recyclable, you know, I would throw it in the trash versus putting it in a recyclable container. And I know that's a little bit against, you know, what most people think, but it's more difficult to actually sort it at a recycling center versus going to a landfill. So let's talk about real quick. We'll talk about the recycling process. I know I'm kind of running up against time here. So let's talk a little bit about the recycling process in collection and sorting. So the first thing that is important when it comes to the recycling process, just like I mentioned, is the collection and sorting on your own terms in your own home. So we think about, hey, we have a recycling container. It's in our kitchen. That's great. We put that out on the curb and it's perfect. Well, what about all the rest of the trash in your home? You know, do you have recycling containers in your restrooms or maybe on your back patio? Probably not. Most people actually usually have those just in their kitchen. So it's really important to start correctly with the collection and the sorting in your own home. So the next thing it goes to is processing and manufacturing. So where does that material go, right? So once it leaves your home, it generally goes to a single stream recycling facility where it gets sorted out and it gets sorted down into different types of materials. And then from there, it actually goes out into the facilities that are purchasing that material. So there are actually recyclers out there that will purchase every single thing that is in your single stream and actually pay money for that. Which is kind of mind-boggling considering that you pay to get rid of your recycling, right? But chances are your recycling center is actually making money off of you because they're sending material off to, say, like a PET recycler or an aluminum recycler, and actually they're getting that rebate back. So that's how a recycling center really makes money. They make money off of you, but they also make money off of the material as it goes out into the market. And then we talked a little bit about consumer participation. You know, really, it boils down to you to make the right decision on what you're purchasing and how you're getting rid of it. Next slide. So we talked about already how do you recycle at home? And I just want to touch on something really quickly, and that is composting. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about composting is how much if you do compost material, how much carbon dioxide you can actually reduce by composting materials versus actually putting them into a landfill or actually putting them into an incinerator. I think it's really important that, again, composting is one of those things that it's difficult to do in the beginning, but if you can really make it a part of your everyday recycling routine to take materials out of your trash that are food grade organic and putting them into a compost type material, it's not only saves you weight and the reduction of materials that are going in your trash, it also helps with fertilizers and other types of materials that you could reuse in your own house. I have to admit, I am fairly new to composting. I have a mother-in-law who's amazing at it, has been amazing at it for a really long time. And one of the things she told me about composting is when you're separating materials, you should always separate them in two colors. So you should have brown material and green material. And when you're mixing that materials together to make a compost, you always want to mix 2 parts brown to 1 part green. And that's really so that the carbon-rich brown materials, such as like dried leaves and other types of materials that turn brown, can mix with really nitrogen-rich green materials. And it creates the best mix for any type of your planting. So again, I'm fairly new to composting. I'm trying to get there. It is a little bit difficult, especially if you have children, to kind of get that perfect mix. But it is something that is beneficial in the long run. One of the things too is that you have to make sure that when you are composting material, that you have plenty of space to be able to collect it. A lot of people see the smaller compost bins. That's a little bit challenging because compost needs a lot of air in order for it to work and break down. So again, a little bit of a challenge in a household environment. Next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about recycling in the workplace. So how do you start, right? And this is where my what I do on a daily basis, this is where I come in, and I help a lot of companies talk about with their employees and their vendors about recycling everything from soup to nuts, where it comes in their front door, how it goes out their back door, and what you're doing with it in between. It can be a little bit challenging in a workplace because it can be expensive. It can be time consuming, and it can be a challenge to get everybody on board. But I will say in the end, a lot of offices and warehouses and manufacturing plants can have very robust recycling programs if education exists. And I've found that the #1 driver for recycling programs in the workplace that fail, they generally come from education. Education and leadership, I guess I should say. So when you don't have a lot of education for your employees, basically stating to them why you're recycling things or how we're recycling things or how things get picked up, and you have a lack of transparency, generally employees they don't buy into it. You know, it's the kind of that greenwashing things that they see the container and that's great, but what happens to it in the end? So what I would say in the workplace, it's super important to get engagement from everyone, from your employees to management to your vendors, and creating a good cycle with each other so that everybody's on the same page. Next slide. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was recycling and climate change. And I think for this one, this is one of those things that we talk about with greenhouse gases, and we talk about where recycling can come into play. So we touched on a little bit where materials go in the end and how they're actually treated in the very end, and what makes sense for certain materials and they're in their end of life. So if you think about, again, I'll go back to an aluminum can. So an aluminum can, when you recycle that material, its emissions and its effects on climate change are so much less than actually mining for virgin material. And there are certain materials out there that are 100% infinitely recyclable, and aluminum is one of them. Cardboard is another. So if you think about paper or cardboard, they can actually be recycled infinitely. And the costs for those materials to be recycled are far less than actually using virgin product. And again, in the simplest terms, if you think about virgin paper or virgin cardboard, it's coming from trees, right? So what do you need to cut down a tree? Machinery. Machinery uses fossil fuels usually to chop the tree down. It goes to a type of mill that generally uses far more energy than it does to go to a recycling center. So International Paper has a huge footprint when it comes to reducing carbon emissions and reducing greenhouse gases. And if you really want an interesting read up on how International Paper is focusing on the climate and what they're doing to reduce all of those things, reducing greenhouse gases and whatnot. They are an incredible company that is such a great steward for everything that we need when it comes to paper. There are a lot of companies out there that are really getting on board with making sure that they're bringing in a certain portion of recyclable material so that they can reduce their carbon footprint and reduce climate change. So I know I went through that kind of quickly, so I think that's my last slide. You can go to the next slide. So this is kind of just my conclusion slide. I don't need to read through all of this, but obviously we talked about a lot of things today. I actually have quite a few things that I don't even think I got the chance to get to, but I think it's apparent, just from what I've done in my career, I'm incredibly passionate about helping people understand the realities behind recycling and what makes sense, right? And getting rid of that greenwashing that often happens, where a company can say, yep, I totally recycle everything that you see. Everything is in good hands after it leaves your home. Or there are even companies out there that do green hushing, where they have a program, say, to be zero landfill by, say, 2030. And now all of a sudden you don't really hear about it. So they have this looming goal out there. So what I would say is, if we want to make an impact on recycling efforts, choose good materials and do your homework on them. It's not always easy to do that, but there's a lot of education out there. There's a lot of information out there on all the products that we use. So that's it for me. What other questions does everyone have? I saw a couple pop in the chat here. John, worth waiting to see the fills later. Thank you. So Shelley, I saw your thing pop up about your township that just added glass to your single stream. I would take precautions to not put your glass in there. I'm not a big proponent of glass being in a single stream. If you work in a manufacturing environment and you have a single stream recycler that takes a container off your site, they won't allow that glass in there. So just kind of, I would ask some questions as to whether or not that glass can actually go in there. Companies that recycle styrofoam. So styrofoam is a really cool material to recycle. So the only way to recycle styrofoam is actually to heat it up, and it actually gets into a densifier. So it actually, so if you look at styrofoam cups and containers, when it goes through that densifier, it shrinks down like, I mean, thousands of cups shrink down into a container that's, or a size of like maybe something that's like a softball. And that actually goes to a foaming center, which actually pumps heat and steam and air at the same time back into that styrofoam, and often it becomes very rigid. So it can actually go into a myriad of different things, but there are plenty of companies out there that recycle styrofoam. It's just a little more difficult, and it's a little more expensive. So Lynette, you asked, well, where does glass go then? Or where should glass go then? Right now, if your glass does not go into a single stream, I would say there are independent glass recyclers that will take your glass if you want to collect it. And you can find those generally just by Googling who recycles glass in my area. They'll usually take it for free. Sometimes if you live in a state where they will pay you for your glass, you should collect your glass and turn your glass bottles back in. Let's see. My county has opened a facility which accepts any plastic and then processes it to be added to concrete blocks. I love this idea. So there's a lot of information out there. It's not technically a concrete block. It's actually a block that's made of mixed materials. It actually has the same density as concrete, and it goes into a whole bunch of different things. I don't think we're quite there yet to make homes out of those kind of blocks. But one of the really great things in it is a great article. If you look it up, there's a company that actually does exactly what you're talking about, that buys that kind of material. And they actually make the, I'm going to use the term Jersey barrier, that's like in the middle of a street or middle of a road. And they take that material and they make it into those types of, forms. So I actually love that, and I think it's a great way to use some of those plastics. If in Bucks or Montgomery County, styrofoam can be recycled, you are very correct, Diane. Again, it's a matter of doing your homework on that, right? Maria, I would say that's incorrect. You can actually recycle styrofoam coolers, but you probably can't recycle those styrofoam coolers through like your just general recycling for your township. You would have to find somebody that actually recycles styrofoam and only recycles styrofoam, and you'd probably need a lot of coolers before they would take your material. They probably won't take your one-off styrofoam cooler. So unfortunately, it's not a really great solution for those one-off things. So let's see. Thank you so much, Charles, for putting that sustainability report in there for International Paper. They really are a great company. If you want to read about them, I think they're just fantastic. Tim asked, how important is it removing plastic sleeves from plastic bottles? Super important. So that plastic sleeve, totally different than the plastic bottle. So if you can actually separate the two, it makes your bottle more recyclable when it gets to the recycling facility. Can they separate it? They can. Will they? Most likely not. But if you do it, it will go into a process where it'll go into different directions. So bottom line, should municipalities not bother to collect anything but number one and number two plastics? Zeta, I'd say yes. Unfortunately, most of the other plastics that end up in that single stream get kicked out, and they usually go to waste energy anyway. It boils down to education, right? So if they're not sitting on this wonderful phone call with all of you guys tonight, most people don't even know that number on the bottom of a plastic bottle exists. You guys obviously do, but again, I mean, most people don't even know that those numbers exist, nor do they even know what they mean. So it's tough.
This is a huge issue. Absolutely huge.
It is.
Because everyone is putting anything that's got a triangle in stream recycling.
Yep.
And then manpower and labor has to basically be used to pull that all out and
Yep.
end up putting it in a trash can anyway.
Yep. Yeah, you're totally right. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that boils down to education, right? So if somebody doesn't know that a number 7 can't go for any type of recycling, they're still going to put it in there, right? They're
But
still
number
gonna,
7 is biodegradable PLA. I mean, this is crazy.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Actually, number 7's anything that doesn't fit in 1 to 6. But
Right.
I mean,
Number
there is
2.
so much misinformation and so much confusion that's really preventing the growth of an industry that could be very successful because of all the extra labor and all the extra effort, which costs real money, which makes them not profitable. I mean, this is, am I right or am I wrong?
No, you are. I mean, you're 100% right. Again, I hesitate because again, we see that triangle on everything, right? And we think, oh, it's recyclable, when that's not really what it means, right? At the end of the day, that's not really what it means. Everything has a different meaning to it. Just depends on what kind of material is. Diane, you asked a question about poly-coated milk cartons. So are you talking about in like large quantities or just like in your household? Household. Okay. So they are difficult in household waste. Anything that's poly-coated. Again, it goes back to manufacturers that don't, it goes back to that European model that I was talking about. In Europe, they don't even use anything that's poly-coated. A lot of it is clear glass. You take that milk bottle back to the store or whatnot. Poly-coated milk cartons are really tough, unless it's in a large quantity, which again, like my facility in Philadelphia, we have a machine that actually will be able to process that. But those smaller kinds coming from households, they generally end up like waste energy. So you had a question, Carol, that our recycling company says you can recycle everything up to number 6. So they're right. You can recycle everything up to number 6, but the question would be, where does that material go when it leaves your home? And when it gets to their recycling center, are they actually sorting all of it? If they're not sorting it, where they're sorting every single kind of plastic, from 1 to 6, chances are after 1 and 2, it generally gets sent somewhere else, usually to waste energy. Shelly asked, why can't 1 and 2 only be used as our plastics? Expense. That's what it boils down to. Usually, I would say some material or some plastics absolutely have to have different chemicals in them, like a number 3, which is a polyvinyl chloride plastic. You just need it. Like, you couldn't put piping in your home that is a number 1 or 2. It would never be rigid enough to be able to withstand like the water pressure from, say, a toilet flush or something like that. You just can't do that. So unfortunately, I wish everything could be made of 1 and 2, but it just can't. Yeah. And I would say when it comes to Europe, Europe uses a lot of materials outside of plastics. They use a lot of metals that have a greater longevity, that don't even really need to be recycled. So if you think about a lot of piping and things like that, they don't even use PVC piping usually in Europe. City of Bethlehem used to take styrofoam at drop-off center 6 months ago, but now website says no more until further notice. And that is because of the cost. It's tough. You got to have a lot of styrofoam. It has to be super clean. And then it goes, like I said, it goes to a process called a densifier. basically melts it all down, and then it gets sent usually overseas. So not easy to recycle. All right, so 8:30. I just want to say thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties we had in the very beginning. But really, I had a great time with you guys tonight. Thank you so much for the questions. I will, well, my email's on the invitation. If you need my information, please feel free to reach out. Like I said, I run a company here in Philadelphia, and I'm super passionate about it. So if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to help. So go Phils.
Thank you so much, Mary Lynn. We really appreciate it. And I'm sorry that we had the difficulties, but it came through great. So really appreciate it. And thanks so much for joining us. We're on hiatus until the end of January. So stay tuned for the next Maria presentation in the last Tuesday of January. We appreciate all your attendance this year, and have a wonderful rest of the year, everyone.
Are there any